Hey guys, tonight we're heading all the way back to 7th century China, a time when the night air smelled like peach blossom incense and slightly overcooked duck, and political intrigue came in lacquered boxes tied with silk. The capital Chang'an was a bustling warren of palace corridors, scholars in high collars and horses that almost certainly judged everyone. And in the middle of it all, beneath the gaze of weary stars and even wearier concubines, a baby named Wu Jiao let out her first cry, possibly loud enough to wake a nearby goat. Now you may imagine that being born into nobility came with perks, gold thread blankets, the occasional jade rattle servants who didn't gossip too loudly. But life in the Wu household was no easy waddle through a lotus pond. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a successful timber merchant who'd earned an aristocratic title, which is like being knighted because you built enough things without them falling over. Her mother, Lady Yang, had high status and very low patience for nonsense. Together they raised their daughter with the kind of ambition that makes you suspicious of toddlers who hold eye contact too long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do let me know where you're listening from. A rainy window, a cramped studio, a yak cart rattling down a dirt road in your dreams. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Little Wu Jiao's early life wasn't exactly steeped in palace glamour, but she was born into a family that smelled power, the way a tavern cat smells leftover eel pie with wild, slightly terrifying intensity. She learned to read young, a rare and frankly suspicious trait in girls at the time, and supposedly showed an unusual interest in state affairs, horses, and other things that made Confucian grandpas mutter into their beards. Historians still argue whether she was educated more thoroughly than her brothers or simply paid closer attention. But by the time she turned 13, she could quote classical texts and side-eye an entire banquet table without blinking. That, dear listener, is the mark of a future empress, or at least a highly underrated dinner guest. Then came the moment that would shift her life from well-read merchant's daughter to historical migraine. She was summoned to the imperial palace at just 14 years old to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong. Now, concubine sounds more glamorous than it is. Think less silken pleasure dome, more endless protocol drills, and constant fear of being ignored into oblivion. The emperor, already a man of graying wisdom and suspicious back pain, had over 1,000 concubines, each fighting for notice like ducks squabbling over rice. Wu Jiao was given the title Kairin the Fifth rank out of 9 in the concubine hierarchy, which made her something like the assistant regional assistant of affection. But unlike the others, Wu had a weapon, her mind. While others embroidered, she memorized military strategy. While others fluttered fans, she observed court rituals like a hawk observing a mouse with poor posture. One curious little detail that gets overlooked. It's said she charmed the emperor's horse, not metaphorically the actual horse. Legend says she could calm even the emperor's notoriously temperamental steed, which may explain why Taizong let her stay longer than most girls with similar job descriptions. Horses don't lie. Still, Taizong never elevated her beyond Kai Ren. She remained in the court's long shadow, her days marked by poetry, politics whispered through silk screens, and the increasingly certain feeling that her story wasn't supposed to end in obscurity. When Emperor Taizong finally died in 649, palace rules dictated the concubines without children must retire to a Buddhist convent, Imagine that, from silk robes to scratchy robes, from politics to prayer beads, all before 20. So off she went, some say, with quiet dignity, others say with secret plans. The imperial scrolls are vague, and the nuns were not in the mood to comment. And here's where we start cooking the stew, metaphorically speaking. Because while most former concubines faded into quiet anonymity, Wu Jiao did something almost no one expected. She came back. But we'll save that return for our next section. For now, just picture her, a young woman with a memory like a mirror and a patience sharper than any jeweled hairpin, sitting cross-legged on a temple mat, watching the incense curl upward, like a question she already knew the answer to. Now, to return to court life after being tucked away in a Buddhist convent, you generally needed three things: divine intervention, a healthy disregard for social norms, and a plan so outrageous that even the palace gossips would pause mid-whisper. Fortunately for Wu Jiao, she had all three, and perhaps a secret fourth: the ability to read the ambitions of others better than they could themselves. It's unclear exactly how she orchestrated her return, but historians agree on this much: she didn't stay a nun for long. The convent was less a place of quiet contemplation and more a holding pen for women who had once been close to power and now were considered awkward reminders. Wu Jiao, however, used her time wisely, chanting sutras, yes, but also absorbing every hint of court news that trickled through incense smoke and visiting monks. Then something unusual happened. Emperor Taizong's son, the new Emperor Gaozong, began paying her visits. And not purely spiritual ones, if you catch the drift. Gaozong had known Wu Jiao from the palace before, but now visiting her in the supposed piety of a temple, something changed. Perhaps it was the robes. Perhaps it was the quiet fire behind her eyes. Or perhaps, and this is my personal theory, it was the way she poured tea like she was already Empress. But here's the problem: Gaozong already had an Empress, and concubines, and an entire palace of women competing for his favor, armed with silks, songs, and strategic tears. Yet none of them quite unnerved or captivated him like Wu Jiao. Returning a former concubine from a previous emperor to court scandalous. Returning your father's former concubine to court. Positively indecent even by palace standards, where, let's be honest, the bar for decency was already somewhere near ankle level. But Gaozong was, let's call him suggestible. Swayed by his own health, troubles a perpetual fog of indecision, and perhaps a desire to be near someone who didn't faint when asked a difficult question, he arranged for Wu Jiao's return to court. Officially, she was a concubine. Unofficially, she was a storm, with good posture. Historians still argue about the nature of their early relationship. Was it love? Was it strategic alignment? Was it one extremely well-brewed pot of chrysanthemum tea that tipped the scales? One Tang-era scroll insists Gaozong claimed she understood his heart. Another claims she simply offered him remedies for his headaches. Knowing Wu Jiao, both might be true. Her return caused ripples. Empress Wang, the current empress, saw Wu Jiao as a minor threat, at first a distraction, a soft-voiced nuisance. She could not have been more wrong. Wu Jiao was a glacier, not a gust. Silent, steady, and capable of crushing anything in her path, given enough time. One lesser-known tale whispered by scribes and recorded nowhere officially involves a palace cat, a mysteriously absent embroidery frame, and a servant who never returned from delivering rose water. These are likely just stories, of course. Likely. But the real turning point came with the birth of Wu Jiao's children. With her bearing Gaozong's offspring, the court could no longer dismiss her as a passing fancy. She was now embedded with roots, twining into the future of the dynasty itself. Then came the infamous incident with Wu's infant daughter. A tragedy. The baby died under mysterious circumstances, and Wu publicly accused Empress Wang of murder. Whether the Empress had anything to do with it remains as always contested. Some say Wu fabricated the entire event. Others claim she simply seized the moment. Either way it worked. Empress Wang fell from grace, her enemies quick to abandon her. And Wu Zhao. She stepped into the empty space like a queen onto a freshly swept chessboard. But even as she climbed, she did not rise with arrogance. At least not the loud kind. She cultivated an image of piety, humility, and maternal wisdom. She attended Buddhist ceremonies. She patronized temples. She was, to the casual observer, a paragon of virtue wrapped in embroidered restraint. Behind the curtain, however, she was assembling allies, dismissing threats, and reorganizing the court's inner structure as if it were her personal tea cabinet. And Gaozong. He seemed content to let her do it, or unable to stop her. Possibly both. There's a strange and rarely mentioned detail from this period. Wu reportedly took a great interest in mirrors, not just for vanity, but for symbolism. Mirrors, after all, were said to reflect not just the face, but the soul. And rumor has it she had them placed in the hallways, in servant quarters, even in the stables, so that no one, not even the horses, could forget who they were serving. A bit much, you might say. But then again, empresses aren't made by moderation. And if you're wondering whether anyone opposed her return to power, of course they did. Ministers grumbled. Eunuchs fretted. Scholars wrote strongly worded essays with very tiny brushes. But Wu Zhao understood something that most of her enemies didn't. Power once taken must be worn like silk armor, soft to touch, impossible to pierce. So ends her first great reappearance. From temple silence to palace center stage, from discarded concubine to the mother of imperial heirs. And all of it accomplished without raising her voice or spilling a single official's soup, at least not in front of witnesses. At this point, if you're wondering how a woman banished to a convent ended up running the empire's gossip circuit like she was editing her own dynasty-sized newsletter, well, you're starting to understand Wu Zhao. Now fully reinstated in court life, she continued her ascent, not by shouting, but by whispering in all the right directions. And where most whisperers vanish the moment the wind changes, Wu Zhao made sure the wind changed for her. When Emperor Gaozong's health began to falter, not in a dramatic collapse, but in that peculiar imperial fashion where headaches start replacing, actual policy Wu didn't reach for power in haste. She waited, she watched, and when she finally moved, it was with the poise of someone who had not only read every scroll in the archives, but made notes in the margins. The court itself had become a place of anxious tea sipping. Eunuchs dashed nervously through corridors with scrolls that read like riddles, and ministers held their breath in meetings that lasted just long enough for their legs to cramp. Gaozong, meanwhile, increasingly relied on Wu to draft decisions, review proposals, and on one occasion choose which concubine's poetry deserved a second glance. Spoiler, it was never the poetry. And here's where it gets particularly tangled in the way only dynastic politics can be. Wu Zhao began ruling from behind the curtain, literally. She would sit behind a silk screen while her husband held court, speaking on his behalf, interpreting his wishes, and occasionally reminding everyone that she was the only one who could get him to eat soup when he was sulking. Historians still argue whether this curtain arrangement was practical, manipulative, or just plain dramatic. But you have to admit it's a strong visual, the emperor faintly glowing behind a translucent screen, his voice suspiciously confident, his wife's silhouette faintly moving behind him like the whisper of fate in a brocade robe. Now remember, Empress Wang and consort Xiao Well, by this point they were both out of the picture, deposed, disgraced, and likely muttering "told you so" to the palace tiles. The way Wu Zhao handled their fall was a masterclass in plausible deniability. The Empress was accused of black magic and jealousy, the consort of conspiracy. Both were executed in silence, and Wu made sure the court understood she hadn't wanted this, of course. But the empire had to be protected. Naturally, one of the more curious details from this time involves a famous bureaucratic reform. Wu Zhao, it turns out, had a fondness for paperwork. She launched systems for merit-based promotions, famously encouraging officials to suggest improvements through anonymous petitions. Of course, this meant the suggestion box became a paranoia-fueled rabbit hole of coded insults, praise disguised as policy critique, and one memorable letter that simply read, "Please replace my supervisor with a rock." Still, her reforms worked, at least better than the previous method, which consisted mostly of family ties and extremely generous wine offerings. Meanwhile, Wu cultivated an image of maternal authority. She was now officially Empress Wu, not just a consort, and she leaned into it with all the ceremonial grandeur available to her. Temple visits, charitable donations, public proclamations about virtue and harmony. But underneath all the incense smoke and polite bowing was a steel thread of control that only tightened with time. She also began to experiment with her public image, sometimes appearing in the court wearing men's ceremonial robes, a statement so subtle yet bold, it caused at least 3 Confucian scholars to faint politely into their own beards. And then there was the business with the phoenix. You see, Wu's supporters claimed she was a reincarnation of the divine phoenix, destined to bring balance to the empire. A lovely idea, a powerful symbol, a slightly alarming bedtime story. If you're trying to sleep, yes, but culturally effective. Whether she believed it or merely tolerated it as good PR is anyone's guess. Personally, I think she liked the drama. There's nothing like divine reincarnation to hush a room. But let's not forget the monks. Wu Zhao, ever the master of imagery, maintained close relationships with Buddhist clergy. She financed temples, commissioned sacred texts, and encouraged the spread of a more populist strain of Buddhism, one that conveniently emphasized female enlightenment. One such sutra, believed to have been edited with her suggestions, depicted the next great sage as a woman. Coincidence? Not likely. One monk in particular, a nervous man named Shui Huayi, rose to prominence thanks to her patronage. He was eccentric, loyal, and said to be especially good at public rituals. Some scrolls suggest their relationship may have extended beyond incense and sutras. Others say he once tried to ride a horse backward to prove humility. Either way, he was later eliminated. And by eliminated, I mean conveniently vanished after becoming inconvenient. That's how the stew simmers in the imperial kitchen. Through it all, Wu Zhao remained composed. Cold, some called her. Calculating, others muttered. But even her critics admitted she was competent in a way that unnerved the entire court. Competence in a woman was deeply suspicious, and yet she flourished. So now, in the flickering light of the Tang court, we have a woman behind a curtain managing an empire, terrifying her rivals, charming her husband, rewriting spiritual texts, and inventing a new model of imperial administration, all before breakfast. Next, we'll watch what happens when that curtain finally lifts and she decides to take the stage entirely. By now, the silk curtain had become less a symbol of modesty and more a kind of stage prop in the grand opera of Empress Wu's ambitions. She had been speaking through her husband for years, gently at first, like someone helping a nervous waiter recite the specials, and then more forcefully, until Gaozong's words sounded suspiciously like her own. Eventually the court stopped pretending. The emperor was still there, technically like the decorative fish on a banquet table, but no one doubted who was doing the real cooking. Gaozong's health continued to decline, with reports of blinding headaches, dizzy spells, and an unfortunate tendency to nod off mid-decree. Some said it was chronic illness. Others whispered about poison delivered slowly, subtly, and possibly disguised as medicinal wine. Historians still argue, of course. Did Wu help his decline along or merely take advantage of it? Like so many things with Wu Zetian, the truth is veiled in incense and plausible deniability. At any rate, by the early 660s, she was functionally running the empire. But running an empire unofficially is one thing, claiming it openly is something else entirely. To do that, she had to remove the final obstacles. And unfortunately for Wu, the biggest obstacle was tradition. Now, tradition is a stubborn beast. It likes dusty scrolls and stern old men and the smell of mildew-soaked bureaucracy. It does not like ambitious women, especially not ones who write laws, commission statues of themselves, and have pet eunuchs with better job security than most governors. But Wu Jia wasn't about to let that stop her. She had already deposed an empress and survived the endless plotting of the inner court. Next on the list, convincing China that a woman could and should rule outright, not as a consort, not as an empress dowager, but as emperor. The emperor. Full stop. There was, however, one small snag. Her husband was still alive, and although he was weak and mostly reliant on Wu to keep the empire spinning in a straight line, he was inconveniently still capable of breathing. This made things awkward. Luckily, or perhaps tragically, depending on your level of optimism, Gaozong passed away in 683, reportedly surrounded by loyal officials, fragrant herbs, and a truly alarming number of unspoken questions. His death gave Wu the opening she needed. Normally, the next emperor would have been one of her sons, and indeed one of them was crowned. Briefly. But Wu, now Empress Dowager, made it clear that she would act as regent until her son was ready. How long would that take, as it turned out? Indefinitely. The boy emperor was nudged aside with all the ceremony of a misplaced tea tray. Another son was tried next. He too failed to rule in any way that pleased his mother. Some say Wu saw them as too weak. Others say she simply didn't enjoy sharing. Either way, both sons were politely removed from power, one to a quiet corner of the palace, the other into obscurity so complete that even the court musicians stopped referencing him in parodies. And so, like a queen in a slow-motion chess game, Wu stepped forward again. Not as regent, not as mother, but as sovereign. It was 690. She declared the founding of a new dynasty, Zhou, interrupting the Tang for a cozy interlude, and proclaimed herself Huangdi, the one and only female emperor in the history of imperial China. Imagine the gasps. The Confucian scholars clutched their scrolls so hard, some developed permanent creases. It wasn't just that she was a woman. It was that she dared to erase the script entirely. She claimed the mandate of heaven for herself, something usually passed through men like a reluctant family heirloom. But Wu Jiao simply reached out and took it, with calligraphy no less. To legitimize her rule, she went all in on celestial signs. She encouraged, or perhaps gently assigned, monks and astrologers to discover omens affirming her divine selection. A sacred stone supposedly rose from a riverbed, etched with glowing characters. a child was born speaking the phrase, "Long live the Empress." One suspiciously poetic squirrel reportedly performed a dance that spelled her name in sesame seeds. Now, were these signs real? Or were they like many imperial miracles, strongly encouraged by generous donations and extremely nervous priests? Historians still debate. Personally, I suspect the squirrel was bribed. Then came the ceremonies. Wu Jiao didn't just ascend, she orchestrated it like a symphony. New titles were created. New rituals were invented. A whole new seal, carved from sacred jade, was pressed into history. And she didn't do it timidly. She stood before the court in full imperial garb, robes of blazing gold, an absurdly heavy headdress, and an expression that could silence thunder. A detail often skipped in textbooks, she adjusted the formal vocabulary of the court. Ministers had to use terms previously reserved for male rulers, but now adapted for her reign. It made grammar teachers weep and Confucian scribes go cross-eyed, but it worked. The bureaucracy bowed, scribes rewrote the scrolls, and the empire woke up with a new ruler, one who did not ask permission. There's a delicious absurdity to this era. Somewhere in Chang'an, a minor official probably woke up one morning, looked at the day's proclamations and sighed, "Oh, I suppose we're rewriting gender and history now. Better sharpen the ink brush." And the people, they grumbled, they marveled, they adjusted. Life under Wu Zetian was about to get even more interesting. But for now, the empire had a new emperor, and she happened to wear perfume and occasionally quote Buddhist scripture while reorganizing the tax code. Next, we'll peek into how that power was kept, with scroll suspicion and a few flaming letters no one dared to open without gloves. Once Wu Zetian claimed the throne in 690, the imperial court became a place of extraordinary order and extraordinary nerves, like a tea house where everyone's smiling just a bit too tightly, and no one dares mention the missing waiter. Now officially, the Emperor of China, not Empress, not Regent, not Mother, who is definitely just helping Wu, wasted no time solidifying her rule. The ink on the new Zhou dynasty's proclamations was still drying when she launched a wave of reforms, and just to keep everyone on their toes, a quiet but relentless purge of her enemies. The Tang dynasty, bless its crumbling scrollwork, had left behind plenty of discontented noble families, fussy Confucian bureaucrats, and ministers with names like Zhang, the extremely inconvenient. These were the folks who wrote lengthy documents arguing why a woman couldn't rule, quoting dusty books, outdated rituals, and in at least one case, a farmer who claimed his ox had bad dreams every time Wu spoke. Wu Zetian did not take these criticisms lightly, nor loudly. She preferred precision. Enter the secret police. Yes, she had one, and not the bumbling kind you see in tavern tales, the "oops, we arrested the cook again" sort. No, her secret police were organized, methodical, and very good at their jobs, which mostly included uncovering treason, suppressing rebellions, and politely removing anyone who expressed too much fondness for the good old days. One method involved accidental promotions. If you were too vocal in your opposition to Wu, you might find yourself assigned to a faraway post, say a rainy tower in the corner of Sichuan, where the tax collectors rode goats and the local archives were guarded by a rooster with a grudge. You were still employed, just very far away. Another involved letters, not the cozy candlelit kind. These were anonymous denunciations. Anyone could write one, usually written with calligraphy that looked suspiciously like your rival's, and once submitted, it was treated as gospel truth until disproven. Disproving, unfortunately, often required being alive, which wasn't always convenient. One famous story. tells of a high-ranking minister who received a folded piece of crimson paper with no name, just a poem referencing plums that rot in winter. 3 days later, he was reassigned to plum orchard duty indefinitely. Coincidence, perhaps, but his beard reportedly turned white overnight. Historians still argue whether Wu's methods were ruthless or simply clever for the times. Some say she ruled by fear. Others say she merely cleaned house with slightly more vinegar than usual. But what's clear is, her bureaucracy became efficient, obedient, and almost suspiciously quiet. Now, I don't think she ruled through terror alone. Wu was far too practical for that. Her administration introduced several genuinely impressive reforms. She improved the civil service examination system, opened more government positions to commoners, and supported education in ways that made even her critics admit quietly that perhaps things were running smoother than expected. And then there was the language. Wu introduced over a dozen new Chinese characters, gloriously complex poetic symbols designed to reflect her virtues. One of the most famous replaced the standard character for heaven with a combination meaning heaven and earth are within the ruler's virtue. Subtle, no. Impressive, definitely. Confusing for calligraphers. Deeply, but let's not overlook the real star of this section, the letters. You see, during Wu's reign, the bureaucracy became obsessed with the written word. Petitions flew like migrating birds. Accusations, recommendations, reports on agricultural output, weather complaints, suspicious dreams, and at least one document detailing a fish that looked like a monk. All were filed, stamped, and copied 3 times. And then came the flame letters. These were private missives burned immediately after reading, sometimes composed in fragrant ink that turned to smoke, scented like sandalwood. Only the emperor and her most trusted advisors used them. What did they contain? No one knows. But several courtiers developed nervous tics whenever incense was lit nearby. A curious fringe detail. Wu reportedly commissioned a type of poetry lockbox, a small sealed container in which poems of loyalty or, more suspiciously, apologies could be deposited anonymously. The most beautiful poem of the month earned a reward. The most questionable, let's just say the writer might receive an invitation to dine with the registrar, which was never a good sign. As her regime solidified, Wu's attention turned to public rituals. She performed elaborate ceremonies on mountaintops, made offerings to heaven, and even staged a rare open-air listening court where commoners could voice complaints. To her credit, she listened. To her enemies' dismay, she also took notes. But not everyone stayed quiet. Dissent simmered like stew, left too long on the hearth. Monks muttered, generals grumbled. And in one particularly bizarre case, a failed rebellion was blamed on a meteor that resembled a woman's face, which palace officials understandably decided not to include in the official records. Still, Wu stood firm. By this time, her former rivals were either removed, converted into allies, or had entered a mysterious early retirement, involving suspiciously isolated villas with excellent fencing. In their place were new faces, officials promoted for merit loyalty or an unusual talent for surviving tea ceremonies without fainting. Wu herself remained a paradox, ruthless yet refined, cruel in rumor, but benevolent in infrastructure. One could argue she was a mirror of the empire itself, beautiful, dangerous, deeply organized, and possibly allergic to criticism. And always, always writing. Next we'll meet the poor ceremonial goat, who couldn't quite perform a proper bow and somehow became the unofficial mascot of imperial excess. Now, in any well-oiled imperial court, there comes a time when ceremony starts eating its own tail. Rituals get longer, bows get deeper. The etiquette guides become so thick they double as furniture. And in Wu Zetian's court, ever fond of symbolism and silk, ceremony blossomed into a full-blown competitive sport, complete with choreographed incense wafting and dangerously pointy hats. It was during one of these elaborate rituals, deep in the marble halls of Luoyang, that the story of the goat unfolded. And no, I haven't finally gone senile from too much stew and not enough ventilation. This tale is well documented, at least if you count whispered memoirs and scribbled jokes in the margins of bored scribes' ledgers. The goat in question was part of a grand imperial procession involving celestial blessings, offerings of sacred barley, and a truly impressive amount of drumming. Wu had instituted a new ceremonial order, blending Buddhist rites with imperial Confucian choreography. Somewhere in this fusion, it was decided, perhaps by a very enthusiastic official, that every being present must offer a bow, even the animals representing the harmony of the natural world. The goats, brought in from the emperor's sacred pastures and brushed to within an inch of their dignity, were led in with golden collars. All went well until one particularly plucky creature, let's call him Magistrate Ba, refused to bow. He stood there staring at the Empress' legs, locked head high, chewing as if to say, "Not today, madam." The court fell silent. The drummers froze mid-beat. A minister dropped his fan. One eunuch may have wept. Now this would have been the end of it. A simple embarrassment had the goat not sneezed immediately after, directly in the direction of Wu Zetian. Historians still argue whether this moment marked the beginning of stricter protocol enforcement or the quiet retirement of the official who oversaw animal compliance. What's clear is that the goat vanished from the record shortly after. Some say he was demoted to pulling ceremonial carts. Others claim he lived out his days on a secluded pasture, revered by junior scribes, as the only soul in the palace with the courage to resist. Regardless, the goat incident came to symbolize what many were quietly feeling the court had become: a bit much. Under Wu's rule, ceremonial life exploded. Morning rituals lasted hours. Ministers spent weeks memorizing the precise number of steps between throne and kneeling mat. One poor official allegedly walked in a spiral for 12 minutes, trying to locate the correct incense tray. But while the rituals were exhausting, they were also strategic. Wu understood the power of performance. Every bow, every chant, every slow-motion offering of fruit told a story that order reigned, that heaven supported her rule, and that no one, even livestock, was above respect. Behind all the pageantry, real changes were brewing. Wu had begun a slow but steady campaign to replace the old guard with loyal officials, men of low birth but high competence. This horrified the aristocracy. Merit in government outrageous. One such official, de Rengier, rose to prominence during this period, a clever man with a sharp tongue and a suspicious love for logic. Dai often challenged Wu's decisions, but unlike many who questioned her, he lived to tell the tale and even earned promotions. Wu, it seems, appreciated a mind that could spar with hers as long as it knew when to stop. Another curious figure was a court astrologer known simply as Master Fox, not for any particularly vulpine features, but because he once predicted a lunar eclipse by observing the way a fox barked at his courtyard lantern. Wu liked him. He was promoted to head of celestial scheduling. Now, while most rulers cement their legitimacy through family alliances or military victories, Wu chose to shape ideology itself. She had Buddhist texts rewritten to emphasize the divine potential of female rulers. She commissioned massive public works, roads, temples, irrigation projects, each bearing inscriptions that subtly reminded everyone of her celestial mandate. But not everything went smoothly. There were famines, floods. One year, a bizarre hailstorm reportedly froze an entire melon crop into oddly shaped cubes. The people, grumbling under their breath and chewing on chilled gourds, blamed heaven. Wu responded with a grand ceremony of apology, personally walking barefoot into a river, weeping convincingly, and offering a scroll to the gods. The rain stopped. The people nodded. The scroll preserved in the palace simply read, "Do better." Still rebellion loomed. Secret societies stirred in the provinces. Former Tang loyalists plotted in tea houses and sent coded messages in poetry form, which meant the secret police had to hire entire teams of literary analysts, poets turned snitches with very conflicted consciences. And yet Wu kept the empire steady. Not perfect, not peaceful, but functional, growing. One fringe detail from this time. It said Wu had a dream of a tree blooming with golden peaches, each one engraved with a different character from the Buddhist sutras. She awoke, declared it an omen, and had an orchard planted in its image. The peaches never grew, but the orchard became a popular picnic spot for off-duty guards. Through all of it, Wu remained unflinching. The throne was hers. The bureaucracy danced. The goat, bless his soul, was never seen again. Next, we step beyond ceremony and into bold declaration, as Wu doesn't just hold the throne. She becomes the dragon on it. By the time the court had fully digested the disappearance of the ceremonial goat and adjusted to the notion that even breakfast should probably be served with incense and a minor hymn, Wu Zetian decided it was time to stop hiding behind symbols. She had worn the robe, she had issued the edicts, she had bowed more graciously than any man who ever wore a hat shaped like a goose. But now she became the dragon. In Chinese imperial symbolism, the dragon throne isn't just a fancy seat with extra pillows. It represents ultimate authority, divine rule, and the right to decide which regions get promoted to important enough for mail service. Up to this point, every person to occupy that seat had one thing in common. Not a single one had dared to be born female. Wu Zetian changed that. In 690, when she officially founded her Zhou dynasty and took the title Huangdi, she wasn't just declaring herself emperor. She was essentially rewriting the celestial contract. It was the administrative equivalent of breaking into heaven's office, tearing up the mandate of heaven, and submitting a revised version with her own calligraphy in the margins, and a polite note that read, "You missed a spot." And she made it stick. She didn't do this by sheer will alone, of course. She did it with politics, with patronage, and with a brilliantly devious awareness of timing. Her ministers, those still standing, had already been seasoned by years of indirect rule. A few made polite noises of protest. Others wrote poems with very complicated metaphors involving fish swimming upstream. But no one dared stand in her way, except the statues. Yes, the statues. In an effort to bolster her legitimacy, Wu commissioned a series of new stone statues across the empire, many of them large, serene, and unsettlingly feminine. One of the most infamous was the wordless stele, a towering stone monument erected outside her eventual tomb, carved with nothing, not a single inscription, just smooth, unyielding stone. No eulogy, no name, no explanation. Historians still argue about it, of course they do. Some believe Wu left it blank, as a challenge. Let the future decide who she was. Others say She feared future rulers would alter or erase her legacy anyway, so she denied them the opportunity. A fringe theory claims she forgot what she wanted to write and died before deciding, though this seems unlikely. Wu Zetian never forgot anything, least of all her own narrative. Elsewhere she erected another statue of the great Sphinx of the East, a strange, possibly feline, possibly lion-like beast, with a face that bore a suspicious resemblance to hers. Again, interpretations vary. Some say it was meant to blend Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist symbolism into one harmonious creature. Others suggest it was simply her way of saying, "Yes, I am terrifying. You may bow now." Meanwhile, at court, the symbolism deepened. Wu wore the imperial yellow reserved for emperors and spoke in decrees laced with literary flourishes and subtle threats. She adopted titles meant to evoke both earthly rule and cosmic authority. One of her chosen names translated to something like Sacred and Divine Sovereign Empress Regnant, which you have to admit has a certain ring to it if you have a breath to spare and a good memory for titles. Longer than your scroll shelf. But if all of this sounds overly theatrical, don't be fooled. Beneath the surface performance, Wu was extraordinarily effective. She reorganized the empire's provinces. She increased food distribution networks. She sponsored new irrigation systems and improved the postal road so thoroughly that even the laziest courier could deliver a message without inventing a camel-related excuse. She kept taxes manageable and grain reserves stocked. Even her critics, usually found in corners of the empire writing secret laments, in 6-line verse admitted that her reign was stable, prosperous, and much to their horror competent. One peculiar fringe fact: during her reign, officials were encouraged to submit botanical samples from their home provinces, flowers, herbs, fruits, and roots to be studied and preserved in a great imperial garden. Some scholars claim this was a veiled surveillance tool, as submitting the wrong flower could imply political rebellion. Others suggest Wu just liked plants. Both are equally plausible. At this point in our tale, the imperial court was running so smoothly that lesser nobles began to complain that there weren't enough scandals to write home about. Poetry competitions sprang up to fill the time. One poem titled Ode to the Accountant Who Never Smiles won third prize and a seasonal peach. But not everyone was thrilled. Rebellion brewed, especially among the former Tang loyalists. They viewed Wu's rule as an aberration, an offense to the ancient order, and possibly the reason their plum harvests were subpar. A few rose up. Most were quashed with the quiet efficiency of a very experienced broom. Still, each rebellion made Wu just a little more precise, a little more guarded. She began sending inspectors to the provinces. Imperial auditors who arrived unannounced, asked too many questions, and left behind scrolls that smelled faintly of roasted anxiety. These agents were called the censors, though one critic referred to them as those who smile while trimming your salary. And what of Wu herself? She continued to rule with the steady hand of a woman who had waited her entire life to sit on that throne. She held court regularly, met with her ministers, and was said to personally review documents with a hairpin in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other. Some say she only slept 4 hours a night. Others say she simply rested her eyes while her scribes continued reading aloud from tax reports. Next, we'll descend into a more shadowy chapter where ink turns to poison, and even the courtiers start watching their teacups a little more closely. By the midpoint of Wu Zetian's reign, the halls of court had taken on a particular smell. Sandalwood incense, lacquered wood, faint ink, and the cold metallic tang of suspicion. It was an era when even silence had corners and every polite smile came wrapped in a ribbon of second thoughts. The bureaucracy ran efficiently, yes, but with the tense efficiency of a household where the stew always simmers, but no one ever lifts the lid. Wu had ascended. The throne was hers, the dragon robe fit. And yet, she did not relax. Perhaps because she knew better than anyone that power is not something one has. It's something one must hold like a porcelain cup filled to the brim with scalding tea. Any tremor, any distraction, and the whole court gets burned. The rebellion attempts had quieted for a time, but the threat of discontent lingered like a draft in a locked room. Wu's answer: paperwork, surveillance, and a growing number of sudden retirements accompanied by very short farewell notes. She expanded the secret police again, and their methods sharpened. Accusations were passed, like folded napkins at a banquet, each filled with polite venom. A rumor began to spread among lower officials. If you received a letter sealed in green wax, don't open it, just start packing. And by packing, they usually meant your final thoughts. One curious but little-known feature of Wu's internal security measures involved inkstone inspections. Every official was required to keep their writing tools immaculately maintained. A smudged brush, it was believed, might indicate a lazy conscience. A cracked inkstone could suggest impure intentions. Did this mean anything? Probably not. But in Wu's court, everything meant something. Historians still argue whether this climate of fear was an invention of her later detractors, or whether it truly reflected the mood of the court. But several surviving letters from minor officials include suspiciously poetic lines like "the shadow behind the scroll is heavier than the words, and even my teacup watches me." Now let's talk about the infamous flaming tablets. According to one fringe account, written years later by a disgraced scribe with a flair for the dramatic, Wu began issuing secret verdicts using wax-sealed bamboo tablets. These verdicts, once read, were to be thrown into a special brazier, a golden basin inlaid with phoenix motifs. The flames burned blue. No one spoke of what was read. The brazier itself was said to emit a low hum, though this was likely the nervous vibration of every courtier within 5 paces of it. Real exaggerated, who knows? But the idea caught on. Soon, every minor official was burning notes, proclamations, confessions, birthday wishes, just in case someone was watching. The court became a theater of controlled combustion. Amid this atmosphere, Wu did something few expected. She opened the door. Not literally, of course. That would have been madness. But she began inviting scholars, monks, and foreign emissaries to court more frequently, and even allowed certain provincial governors to submit direct memorials to her, bypassing the usual channels. This, in theory, encouraged innovation and honesty. In practice, it meant that thousands of scrolls flooded into the palace, each competing for her attention with increasingly elaborate calligraphy and suspicious amounts of perfumed parchment. Some of these petitions were brilliant. Others were barely disguised bribes wrapped in proverbs. One memorable scroll, preserved in part by a bored archivist, read, "May your virtue shine brighter than 1,000 sun-dried yams." It was tragically unsigned. But not all was paranoia and poetry. During this period, Wu expanded the imperial examination system, further offering exams more frequently and to a broader population. She encouraged talented individuals of lower birth to rise through merit, and many did. It was one of her most radical and enduring policies. one that outlived her, one that reshaped China for centuries. But of course it also served her perfectly new officials, elevated by her hand, had no loyalty to the old aristocratic families. Their allegiance was to the woman who gave them their pens. Meanwhile, at home, her personal life became complicated. Wu, now well into her 60s, had seen off 2 sons from the throne and surrounded herself with younger favorites, attendants, scholars, poets, men who flattered, entertained, and possibly did a lot of dramatic reading aloud in very soft lighting. One pair of brothers, the Zhangs, became especially influential. Tall, charming, and utterly devoted to her, they rose quickly in court, earning nicknames like the Imperial Darlings and those 2 with the matching slippers. The court grumbled, of course. Rumors swirled. One scribe composed an anonymous satire titled "The Silk Fan Never Sleeps," which was never officially published, but was mysteriously found in every teacup across the southern wing of the palace. Still, Wu seemed unbothered. She held morning court, read petitions, debated tax reform, and occasionally hosted poetry contests with suspiciously specific prompts like "Ode to the Eternal Glory" of the Jade Empress, who is definitely still listening. And always the tension hummed underneath. Some nights the lamps in the Hall of Supreme Harmony were said to flicker on their own. A few courtiers whispered of ghosts, those who had vanished, those who were erased, those who still lingered in the echo of the stone tiles. A monk reportedly claimed he heard voices behind the bamboo screens reciting old Tang laws in reverse. He was later reassigned to goose-keeping duty near the western pond, and yet Wu Zetian remained, unshaken, as sharp as ever. She watched, she ruled. She measured every word like a grain of rice in a golden scale. Next, we descend even deeper into the shadowy corners of the court, where poets sleep under beds, monks regret their sermons, and one imperial eyebrow becomes a matter of national philosophy. There comes a time in every empire, usually somewhere between the 3rd poetry contest and the 15th suspicious retirement, when things begin to stretch. Not fall apart exactly, just stretch, like a tapestry pulled a bit too tight across a drafty wall. Fine on the surface, but with just the faintest hint of a seam beginning to tremble. This was the court of Wu Zetian in her later years. Her reign remained unchallenged. The roads were smooth, the grain stores full, and the courtiers still bowed so deeply they occasionally dislocated something. And yet the palace had grown quiet in a particular way. The kind of quiet where everyone is still talking, but no one quite says what they mean. Let us begin with the poets. By this point, poetry had become the unofficial currency of survival. A well-crafted couplet could earn you favor. A misplaced metaphor, exile. One hapless scholar submitted a poem that compared Wu to the setting sun, noble in descent. It was meant to be reverent. Instead, he was immediately sent to a province so remote the only form of communication was interpretive goat-scratching. Then came the curious tale of the poet who lived under the Empress's bed. His name was Shen Yuji, though that may have been an alias, a nickname, or a particularly lazy pun. According to fringe sources, Shen was known for his lyricism and loyalty. He once wrote a poem so beautiful it made an entire dinner party burst into tears and forget their spoons. Wu Zetian liked him, or at least liked his poetry enough to keep him nearby. Very nearby. The rumor, which to be fair has never been fully disproven, is that Shen was instructed to sleep beneath the Empress's bed so that inspiration could strike at any hour. She would ring a bell, whisper an idea, and he would roll out like a bedtime spirit with a quill and a scroll. Was this true? Was it satire? Was Shen perhaps simply trying to escape rent? Historians still argue. But someone once found a tiny calligraphy set beneath the imperial bed frame during a renovation in the Song dynasty, and honestly, that's all I need to believe it. Meanwhile, the Empress's rituals continued only now with an extra layer of theatricality. Her eyebrows, once subtle arches of authority, had become national events. Yes, her eyebrows. In her later years, Wu popularized a fashion trend known as the reverse crescent, a brow style so severe it appeared to be actively judging you. Eyebrows in the Tang court were no laughing matter. They were inked, shaped, and sculpted to convey everything from seasonal mourning to military enthusiasm. Wu's were sharp upward and unyielding, a sign that heaven was still watching, and it had notes. Noble women followed suit, though not always successfully. One memoir from a courtier's wife simply reads, "I tried the Empress's brow. Husband fainted. Children fled. I have returned to normal life." And then there were the monks. Once so integral to Wu's image and political machinery, their influence had begun to wane. The Buddhist clergy, which had long supported her right to rule, was growing uneasy. Some felt her favoritism had drifted toward her personal attendants and the infamous Zhang brothers. Others simply felt she had moved too far from the principles she once claimed. One particular monk, an elderly, cautious man named Huai, had once been among her closest spiritual advisors. There were whispers of affection, even of romance, though that may have been the work of bored scribes with too much ink and not enough sense. Huai, once favored, grew jealous of the Zhang's rise. Tensions rose, and in a dramatic, slightly tragic turn, he attempted to burn down part of a temple in protest, or passion, or both. He was quickly arrested. What followed was less a trial and more a graceful erasure. Huai's name was removed from several scrolls, his statue in one shrine replaced with a generic bodhisattva holding what looked suspiciously like a mop, and he was never spoken of again. Not officially. It's said that Wu wept when she heard. Whether from sorrow, guilt, or pure theatrical flair, no one could say. But she continued her prayers. That evening, head bowed, hands clasped, and not a single eyelash out of place. The Zhang brothers, meanwhile, enjoyed the fruits of imperial affection. Promotions, estates, titles. They strutted through court in robes so bright they were visible from space, and their poetry, regrettably, was often read aloud. One of them wrote a love ballad to the Empress's shadow. The other composed a series of odes to her wisdom, comparing her to a river that bends but never breaks. The scroll was printed on rose-colored parchment. Several ministers reported stomach aches shortly after reading it. Still Wu ruled. Old age may have crept into her joints, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to receive reports, make appointments, and deliver edicts with a quill as steady as ever. And yet behind the scenes, something was changing. The court had begun to calcify. Innovation slowed. Flattery increased. Some whispered that the Empress's brilliance was becoming dimmed by those around her, by the constant praise, the curated information, the excessive rituals. There were no more Direngis to challenge her, only dancers, poets, and ministers with smiles polished daily. The empire remained strong, but the Empress, she was becoming isolated, surrounded not by thinkers, but by echoes. Still she woke each morning, donned her robes, and faced the throne. She had not reached this height to falter now. Next, we step into the beginning of the end, where family schemes, Titan age whispers, its reminders, and the most powerful woman in China, must begin to consider what comes after the dragon. It is one of history's quieter tragedies that even emperors divinely mandated, silk-robed, perfumed by golden incense, and flattered daily by ministers with metaphors for tongues, must eventually grow old. By the 700s, Zetian was in her 70s, a remarkable age in any era, but especially in one where most people didn't live long enough to complain about the quality of millet. And yet, even as the weight of the years pressed upon her bones, she remained the most powerful figure in the empire. Her eyebrows still arched like defiant swans, her silks still shimmered like starlight, and her tongue, well, let's just say it, still made ministers rethink their career choices mid-sentence. But time, as it does, began to murmur. It began subtly in ways even she could not immediately notice. A longer pause between appointments, a forgotten name here or there, a missed line in a decree corrected not by her but by a eunuch who coughed just loud enough to draw her attention. Small things, insignificant. And yet to someone like Wu Zetian, who had ruled every inch of her world with the precision of a calligrapher balancing a single drop of ink, it was unacceptable. She tried to tighten her grip, to assert herself more firmly. More edicts, more appearances, more midnight poetry readings where even the Zhang brothers' increasingly bizarre odes one involved a metaphor comparing her wisdom to a snow leopard trapped in a wine jar, were welcomed with applause. But the cracks were showing. Her family sensed it, they always do. She had long since sidelined her sons, those unfortunate boys who had once upon a time technically been emperors for about as long as it takes to boil a turnip. But now those same sons, now grown waiting and heavily advised by their own allies, began to whisper. So did the court, and so did the guards. One particularly observant eunuch is said to have remarked, "When the lantern flickers, even the moths grow bold." He later received a very comfortable reassignment to the imperial stables, where the horses found him delightfully philosophical. The Zhang brothers, meanwhile, were enjoying their golden hour. Wu's affection for them had only grown stronger as her body weakened. They served as companions entertainers, and according to one particularly unkind poem, decorations with teeth. They used their proximity to power to amass titles, influence, and enemies in equal measure. One of them, Zhang Changzong, even tried his hand at medical treatments. He claimed to have concocted a special elixir that would preserve the Empress's youth. The ingredients included dew from sacred lotus leaves, crushed pearls, and what one official rather unfortunately identified as possibly cinnamon, possibly powdered deer. The Empress drank it anyway. Whether the tonic worked or simply gave her excellent dreams is unclear, but she continued to rise each day, attend to matters of state, and issue proclamations in a voice that, while a touch softer, still silenced entire rooms. Then came the turning point. In 705, illness struck more decisively. Not just headaches or stiffness, but something deeper. Fever, fatigue, a fog behind the eyes that even the cleverest poets couldn't chase away. She withdrew from court sessions, delegated more decisions. The Zhang brothers grew bolder, and the ministers grew restless. Some claimed the empire was no longer being ruled at all, merely sung to by two overly fragrant men with excellent cheekbones. And so a plan began to form. Led by court officials and military commanders, a coup was quietly prepared. Not with swords in the night or dramatic rooftop chases, this was a bureaucratic coup, the kind where the real danger was delivered in carefully worded memoranda and politely sharpened tea trays. On a cold morning in early 705, the conspirators moved. They entered the palace, confronted the Zhang brothers, and depending on which scroll you believe, either politely arrested them or threw them headfirst into a decorative pond before dealing with more permanent consequences. Either way, they were gone. The Empress, weakened and bedridden, was forced to abdicate. There was no speech, no final decree carved in jade, just the quiet transfer of power back to her son, Zhongzong, who resumed the Tang dynasty like a man slipping into an old, slightly musty robe and pretending it still fit. Wu was moved from the central palace to a quieter compound. There she was treated with respect, outwardly at least. She was still the mother of the emperor, still a figure of awe and legend. But she was no longer in command, and yet even in abdication she left an impression. One of her final recorded acts was to request that her tomb bear no inscription, no lengthy eulogy, no list of accomplishments, just the wordless, steely, tall, silent, and smooth as memory. Historians still puzzle over this. Was it humility, defiance? An invitation for others to tell her story, or a warning that no one ever truly could? A curious footnote for weeks after her removal. Officials reportedly still paused before speaking, expecting her voice to interject from somewhere above. Even the royal astrologer claimed the stars hesitated. And perhaps they did. Next, we'll descend into what came after the legacy she left, the lies they told, and the strange warmth of a name too powerful to be written down. After Wu Zetian's abdication, the court exhaled one of those long collective sighs that smells faintly of ink incense and the relief of no longer needing to rehearse 5 synonyms for radiant in every imperial memo. Her son, Emperor Zhongzong, returned to the throne like a man stepping back into his childhood sandals, comfortable, familiar, and slightly too small for the moment. But if anyone thought the legacy of Wu Zetian would politely dissolve into mist like a forgotten incense stick, they were in for a surprise. For one, she hadn't really gone. Yes, she had retired. Yes, she no longer ruled. But she still lived in the palace compound, surrounded by attendants, courtiers, and, rather alarmingly, several parrots, reportedly trained to say things like, "Long live the Empress," whenever visitors walked past her courtyard. One monk claimed a parrot corrected his pronunciation of a Buddhist chant. He left shortly thereafter to pursue a quieter life among less judgmental birds. Wu lived for several months after her abdication, fading slowly. During this time she met with very few people. She wrote less, she observed more, and it is said that even in her final days, her hair was combed each morning into a perfect coil, her robes folded so precisely that servants whispered, "Even the wind doesn't dare wrinkle her." She passed away later that year quietly, without fanfare. And then the rewriting began. Not of her life, not yet, but of her reputation. You see, once she was no longer alive to scowl decree or inquire about your family's loyalty levels, over tea the court got busy. Ministers began reviewing edicts. The scribes retrieved old scrolls. Family genealogies were suddenly rediscovered. And slowly, cautiously, the revision of Wu Zetian's story began. Her name, which had graced temples, coins, and poems, began to be softened, then blurred, then quietly replaced. Some called her reign the interruption, as though she'd simply wandered into the Tang dynasty's living room and rearranged the furniture. Others claimed she had been a usurper, a tyrant, a corrupting force who elevated the lowborn and dismissed the noble out of personal spite. One historian, likely working overtime and in desperate need of a foot rub, composed an epic 10-volume denunciation of her reign, creatively titled "On the Empress Who Wasn't Supposed to Be There." It contained such gems as she was cunning and therefore unfit, and she smiled too little to be beloved and too much to be feared. But not everyone joined the smear campaign. Among the common people, Wu retained a strange and stubborn popularity. Peasant women named their daughters after her. Market stalls sold charms invoking her strength. Street performers recited half-true tales of how she had once disguised herself as a man to rescue a province from a flood, or how she'd turned a plum tree into a sword with a single glare. Historians still argue whether this folk affection was real or a later romantic invention, but there's no denying that Wu had become somehow both larger and vaguer than her own lifetime. She was no longer just an empress or even an emperor. She had become a figure of myth, a symbol, a shadow, walking the border between reverence and regret. One curious incident from this period involved a scholar named Liu, who tried to publish a balanced history of Wu Zetian's reign. His manuscript, The Mixed Virtues of the Dragon Woman, made it through 2 pages before he was reassigned to the Imperial Goose Registry, where he spent the next 10 years naming birds and wondering where it all went wrong. Even in silence, Wu inspired anxiety. The court tried to erase her by overwriting. They elevated her sons. They celebrated the Tang dynasty's restoration. They composed music, painted new murals, and held festivals about loyal men. But somewhere in the corner of every banquet hall, it seemed there was always one empty chair, or one poem that no one dared recite, or a servant who remembered the way she used to pause before issuing an order not to hesitate but to calculate. And then there was the Stele. Outside her tomb stood the wordless Stele, towering blank and infinitely loud. Every ruler after her would see it. Every visitor would wonder why. Every historian would project their own meaning onto that stone, some with reverence, others with scorn. But none would fill it. Some claimed she left it blank out of modesty, others out of arrogance. Still others believed it was a final joke, a challenge to history itself. Go on. Try to summarize me. And really, how could you summarize her? She had been concubine, nun, mother minister, monarch. She ruled for decades. She crushed rebellions, promoted commoners, strangled dissent, encouraged learning, eliminated rivals, built temples. And yes, may have once had a man live under her bed purely to revise metaphors at midnight. She was terrifying. She was brilliant. She was not supposed to exist. And yet she did. Next, we walk the borderlands of memory where history, rumor, and myth blur like ink in the rain, and Wu Zetian's ghost quietly refuses to fade. Now let's take a slow, candle-lit stroll into the afterlife, not the spiritual kind necessarily, but the stranger, more bureaucratic one known as historical memory. Because while Wu Zetian's body was laid to rest in a tomb shared with her husband, yes, the very emperor she once usurped the battle for her legacy, had only just begun. The tomb itself. Jianling sits nestled between soft, sloping hills, like a sleeping ox with secrets in its belly. It's guarded by stone creatures, lions, horses, birds, that may or may not have been based on real species. And of course, the wordless Stele, still standing, still silent, still daring you to have an opinion. And history did. Oh, it did. In the centuries following her death, Wu became a kind of historical ink blot. Scholars, poets, and political reformers all saw in her what they needed to see. To some, she was the dark warning of what happens when a woman is allowed too much power, used as a cautionary tale in treatises and tea-house fables alike. To others, she was a rare, glittering example of merit over birthright, a woman who broke the mold, not because it was weak, but because it was wrong. Some painted her as a cruel manipulator, others a benevolent reformer. Still, others claimed she was just really good at administration and somewhat less good at letting people retire peacefully. A fringe detail unearthed from an obscure Song Dynasty diary mentions that at least one statue of Wu in a remote province had been secretly maintained by a group of elderly women who offered incense and whispered thanks at her feet, not for her power, but for her example. Was it true? Hard to say. But it feels like something that would happen in a world still struggling to figure her out. Even the Tang dynasty, after it was restored, couldn't quite decide how to handle her. They couldn't deny her accomplishments. Her reign had been stable, prosperous, and frankly, impressive. But they also couldn't fully embrace her, lest the whole fragile edifice of male authority begin to wobble like a poorly balanced scroll rack. So they did what bureaucracies always do when faced with complexity. They filed it under awkward and moved on. Centuries later, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, Confucian historians got to work smoothing her out. They emphasized the executions, the paranoia, the eyebrow situation. They downplayed the infrastructure, the civil service reforms, and the whole she ruled better than most emperors thing. The result was a kind of moral jigsaw puzzle. If you arranged the pieces just right, you could pretend she hadn't really been as effective as she was. But the records still stood. Grain records, military dispatches, scrolls of tax data, exam rosters, stone inscriptions on bridges that still bore her seal. Her reign had left fingerprints everywhere. And those fingerprints told a very inconvenient truth. She knew what she was doing. One curious fringe theory from the late Qing period suggests that some of her more controversial policies, like the secret police and the anonymous suggestion boxes, were actually proto-democratic experiments. This, of course, caused at least 3 historians to choke on their tea, and several others to rewrite their dissertations mid-sentence. Modern historians, they're no more united. Some hail her as a feminist icon, others as a ruthless tyrant, but almost all agree on one thing. She was an anomaly, a disruption, a crack in the mirror that showed what might happen if you stopped assuming the frame had to look a certain way. And outside academia, in the broader imagination, Wu Zetian refuses to go quietly. She appears in plays, novels, TV dramas where she's always portrayed as either unbearably noble or suspiciously good at poison. In one recent opera adaptation, she sings a 6-minute aria while balancing a jade scepter and correcting the lyrics of her own coronation song. In another, she's reincarnated as a detective solving crimes across the dynasties with the help of a talking fan. It is honestly kind of charming. But here's the thing about legacy. You don't get to decide what survives. Not even if you're an emperor. Not even if you rewrote the language itself and told heaven to send you a memo if it disagreed. What survives of Wu Zetian is contradiction. She was soft-spoken and sharp-tongued, devout and pragmatic, feminine and imperial. She ruled with compassion and cruelty, wisdom and watchfulness. She destroyed families and elevated peasants. She wrote poetry. She burned scrolls. She kissed babies. She signed execution orders with a flourish that was said to be heartbreakingly elegant. Was she good? Was she bad? That's the wrong question. She was powerful, and power in human hands never sits still long enough to be labeled. Next, we'll descend one more step into the realm of dreams, where Wu walks through bamboo forests with scrolls tucked beneath her arm and the ghosts of poets still beg her to read just one more line before dawn. If you listen closely, deep in the folds of dream-soaked history, you can still hear her footsteps, soft, measured, echoing down corridors, no longer standing. Zetian did not vanish when she died, not entirely. She lingered. In the old palaces of Luoyang, guards once claimed to hear the faint rustle of silk at night long after the halls were empty. One steward, a man so rational he once corrected a god's spelling in a dream, swore that a breeze had turned his lantern toward the throne room of its own accord. The flame flickered sideways, dancing as if drawn by a figure unseen. When he opened the doors, no one was there. Just the scent of orchids and the eerie hush of absence that knows it is being watched. So yes, let's speak of ghosts. Because Wu's afterlife didn't play out in spiritual realms alone. Her ghost lived in paper, in ink, in nervous footnotes, in every historian's guilty paragraph that begins. Despite her many flaws, it must be noted that she became the ruler no one wanted to admit worked. Confucian scribes tried to flatten her into an object lesson. Here lies the danger of a woman with ambition. But the lesson always crumpled under the weight of her record. You could criticize her methods, yes. You could invent increasingly creative moral condemnations. One critic in the Song dynasty actually compared her reign to a banquet held in a tomb, lit by the smile of a wolf. It's beautifully written. It also doesn't explain the record-high grain yields or the roads that still bore her name. Even as dynasties rose and fell, Wu's story remained stubbornly unerasable. For every attempt to reduce her to a cautionary tale, another voice quietly noted her effectiveness. A Tang-era tax ledger preserved in a temple wall included the line standardized in the 12th year of the sacred sovereign's rule. No editorial, no flourish, just fact. And then there are the dream records. You see, it was not uncommon in later dynasties, particularly during political upheaval, for officials to report dreams featuring past emperors. This allowed them to express opinions about the present without, getting fired, stabbed, or demoted to beet harvest duty. And Wu appeared in many of them. She was seen walking beside a river, looking down at the water and saying, "I told you they'd come back to me." She was seen at a banquet where all the dishes were made of paper and the courtiers had no mouths. She was seen in a library quietly rearranging scrolls, removing some, adding others. She never spoke, just nodded once and vanished. What do these mean dreams don't explain themselves? But even in this ghostly form, Wu seemed composed, intentional, and inconveniently present. One popular folktale, likely embroidered by storytellers over centuries, tells of a wandering scholar who arrived at an abandoned shrine in the hills of Hubei. Cold and lost, he found shelter under its collapsed roof. That night, a woman appeared in the doorway, tall, regal, her hair adorned with jade pins. She offered him warm tea and asked what he studied. "History," he said nervously. "Be kind," she replied, "or be accurate. But never be both." He woke up alone, the fire still burning, and a single plum blossom blooming beside his head. The story ends with him becoming a historian of great renown, though he refused to write about emperors ever again. Now, is that tale true? Of course not. But it's been told for centuries. And in a way that makes it true enough. Historians still can't agree on who Wu Zetian truly was. Some cling to the tyrant narrative. The executions, the palace intrigues, the whisper of blood on brocade. Others champion the reformer, the elevation of the poor, the merit-based exams, the attention to infrastructure and civil order. Most of us frankly try to do both, because ignoring either half feels dishonest. There is a kind of reluctant awe that permeates most scholarly work about her, as if every author, no matter how critical, eventually looks up from their scroll and whispers, "But my gods, she did it. She rose, she ruled, she survived. She rewrote the rules of gender governance and godliness in a single lifetime, and no matter how many scrolls were burned, rewritten, or buried in damp archives, her name kept resurfacing, sometimes hidden, sometimes unspoken, sometimes disguised under titles like the Lady of the Divine Mandate or the Sovereign Without Precedent, but always her. Even today, school children in China know her name. Popular media depicts her as a clever detective, a ruthless villainess, a misunderstood icon, a romanticized legend. She is still being rewritten. And maybe that's the most honest legacy of all, because Wu Zetian didn't leave a neat moral. She left a mystery, a question, a long, deep hum beneath the surface of imperial history that asks, what if power isn't about who deserves it, but who dares to take it, hold it, and not let go? Next, we descend into the dusk of our tale, where her statues stop blinking, but the empire still carries her imprint in its roads, its records, and in every woman who was told to stay silent and didn't. Let's drift now, gentle and slow, into the strange after hours of an empire, the part of the story where the fires are dying down, the servants are sweeping the last crumbs of a dynasty off the marble floor, and the ghosts begin their nightly shuffle between memory and misquotation. Wu Zetian was gone, but her absence was a presence in itself. In the court of her son, Emperor Zhongzong, once the boy she'd benched, twice the puppet she'd reinstated. Her memory was treated with a kind of nervous reverence. Officially, they honored her. Unofficially, they edited her out of anything that involved glory, innovation, or the word effective. She became instead a polite blemish, acknowledged but not explored. Still, the court couldn't quite get rid of her. Her statues, for example. One of them, carved in the later years of her reign, stood just beyond the palace gardens. It depicted her not as a divine being or a dragon-throned emperor, but simply as a woman holding a scroll. No headdress, no weapons, just her face, calm, watching, slightly amused. After her death, no one dared remove it. So it stayed. And over time it acquired a habit. Visitors reported strange feelings, as if the statue's eyes had moved, as if the mouth had just slightly curled. One elderly minister swore he heard the statue sigh when he passed by with yet another tax proposal. The guards called it the Lady. No one joked about her twice. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the country continued. Roads remained paved. Irrigation channels built under her administration continued to deliver water to farmers who had no idea their cabbages owed thanks to a woman historians refused to mention by name. In one remote province, a mid-level magistrate found an old tax reform scroll bearing her seal and used it verbatim to calm a rebellion over grain prices. When asked where he got the idea, he simply shrugged and said, "An old scroll never lies. That scroll is now in a museum." The Empress's name on it was sanded off, sometime during the Ming Dynasty, but under the right light, with the right tilt of the parchment, it's still there. Ghost handwriting. And then there's the poetry. Wu had written poems during her life, not many, but enough to get filed away. Most of them were ceremonial, the kind meant to impress visiting monks or politely confuse rival queens. But one survived that scholars still argue over. It was short, barely a whisper. Though heaven sets the mountain high, it is the woman who climbs it. Some claim it's a forgery. Others say she wrote it in her final days. A few believe it was never meant to be shared at all, just a thought she scrawled on a practice scroll, later salvaged by a curious scribe with a sentimental streak. Either way, the poem traveled. Quietly. It showed up in school books, in footnotes, in wedding vows spoken in remote villages by women whose grandmothers taught them the words. The poem, like the woman who may have penned it, proved strangely unkillable. Even the Zhang brothers, once vilified as empty-headed consorts of vanity and intrigue, were eventually reclaimed by certain dramatists as tragic figures, beautiful fools caught in a much larger mind's web. One popular opera recast them as loyal friends who died trying to protect her from jealous ministers. It's nonsense, probably, but the costumes are fantastic. And still she lingered, not just in stories, but in architecture, in the layout of the courts she had reorganized, in the tax reforms still referenced generations later, in the careers of countless scholars whose great-great-grandfathers had once passed exams under her watchful eye. It is difficult to fully erase someone who redesigned the floor plan. There was also a report, unverified but too delicious not to mention, that a traveling monk once saw her likeness painted on a temple wall in Tibet, not as an emperor, but as a bodhisattva, a bringer of balance. The mural was said to show her smiling slightly, cradling a scroll in one hand, and stepping on a demon made entirely of angry Confucian scholars. The mural, if it ever existed, has long since vanished. Still, wouldn't that be something? Because in the end, what Wu Zetian achieved wasn't just rulership, it was narrative disruption. She changed the shape of what was possible, not through rebellion, not through revolution, but through patience, calculation, and the kind of intellect that could sort out a palace full of competing ministers before breakfast. She didn't burn the world down. She rearranged it, then handed you a list of new instructions and dared you to call it chaos. One late Tang philosopher wrote somewhat nervously, "The Empress's reign was like a dream too strange to endure, too orderly to forget." It's not a compliment, but it's close. Next, we begin our descent toward quiet, the final memories, the stillness of the tomb, and the soft echo of an empire that once dared to bow to a woman with a pen. Section 15. Let's step softly now into the part of the story where things quiet down. The feasts are over, the brush strokes dry. The ministers, poets, and parrots have all moved on or been replaced by newer models with shinier tails and less memory. But the tomb remains, the stone endures, and Wu Zetian at last sleeps. Her final resting place, Qianling Mausoleum, lies atop Mount Liang, where the wind hums across grassy ridges and the clouds settle low like thoughtful monks. It's a double tomb. She shares it with Emperor Gaozong, her husband, the man whose throne she commandeered with the delicacy of a silk-threaded siege. It's ironic, isn't it? After all the coups, decrees, lovers, rituals, scrolls, and steely stares, she ends up side by side with a man history often remembers as half asleep and gently bewildered by the very woman now interred next to him. But maybe that's how history works. It binds the powerful to the powerless, the myth makers to the footnotes, the dreamers to the dust. You won't find her name carved above her tomb, just that great, smooth, blank stele, towering, silent, patient. Some say the wordless stele is her challenge to historians. Others say it's her revenge. Still, others suggest She simply trusted no scribe to get it right, so she chose to write nothing at all, because no words, no matter how flowery or formal, could ever measure the enormity of a life like hers. And truly, what would you even carve? She ruled. She rewrote the rules. She outlasted them all. Too small, too obvious, too neat. Better to say nothing. Let the mountains speak. In the centuries that followed, Qianling became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not the noisy, incense-clogged kind, but the slow, wandering sort. Scholars came heads bowed, scrolls tucked under their arms, some to pay respects, some to gawk, some, let's be honest, to argue with a stone. In one account from the Yuan dynasty, a Confucian student spent an entire afternoon reading aloud the arguments against Wu's reign, pausing now and then for dramatic effect. After he finished, a sudden gust of wind knocked over his ink pot. He went home and became a fisherman. Interpret that as you will. Later, archaeologists tried to open her tomb. Tried. The structure proved far more complex than expected, booby-trapped, with stone falls sealed by layers of ancient engineering that seemed designed not just to prevent grave robbing, but to say, no, you don't get to peek. Some now believe her tomb holds vast records, edicts, poems, personal notes, an entire hidden archive, untouched, waiting. If so, it remains buried, quiet, stubborn, just like her. And what of her legacy? It's no longer just about history now. Wu Zetian has crossed into the strange country of cultural memory where facts matter less than symbols, and truth wears a different robe depending on the day. In modern China, she is many things: a feminist icon, a tyrant, a visionary, a villain. Television dramas give her 6 different accents. Children learn about her in school books, with footnotes that carry more questions than answers. Tour guides at her tomb whisper different stories, depending on the tourist's facial expression. And somewhere, perhaps, in a quiet mountain village, perhaps in a bustling cafe, a young woman writes an essay about leadership or power or destiny. And at the corner of her paper, just as decoration, she draws a tiny scroll with no title. No one knows why. But she smiles as she draws it. Historians still argue. They always will. But you and I, we know a bit more now. We've walked through her world, through incense halls and cold scroll rooms, through whispering courtyards and the long winding corridors of power. We've seen the girl with the sharp eyes in the convent, the woman behind the curtain, the emperor on the throne, the legend in the silence. And now we close the scroll. Next we slip into the wind down, where the fire burns low, the night deepens, and the ghost of Wu Zetian finally lets you rest. There's something peculiar about the way an empire remembers and misremembers its dead. It's not like the way families remember a grandmother or a neighbor, or even a beloved old dog. No, when an empire remembers someone, it folds them into layers of performance paperwork and seasonal festivals until they become less of a person and more of a mood. And Wu Zetian, long buried beneath stone and legend, had become precisely that. By the Song dynasty, a few hundred years after her death, the official records had been edited enough times to resemble less a scroll and more a palimpsest, a manuscript written over so many times it hums faintly with contradiction. She was a wicked usurper, yes, but also strangely effective. A cautionary tale, but also a case study. Some called her a demon in robes, others a phoenix in disguise. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the court had moved on. New dynasties, new faces, new scandals involving ink theft and extremely judgmental courtiers. Yet every now and then something would happen, a policy proposed, A tax reform floated, a minister from humble origins promoted, and someone would murmur, "Wu would have liked this." Quietly, always quietly. Let's talk for a moment about the bard who sang too loud. Yes, he's real. Well, mostly. His name doesn't survive. He goes by various titles depending on which tavern scroll you're reading. The Fool of the Phoenix Court. The Man with the Lute. That one who vanished. He was a musician in the decades after Wu's death, known for satire and songs sharp enough to peel wallpaper. At one of the seasonal festivals near the old imperial capital, he performed a song that began innocently enough, praising the Tang restoration, the current emperor's beard, the grain quality. But then somewhere around the third verse, things turned cheeky. He compared Wu Zetian's court to a stew pot where the carrots ran the kitchen. He joked that the Confucians had only learned to bow properly once they feared her elbows. He ended by saying, "If she were still here, the rice would be hot and the scholars would be nervous." The crowd laughed. Too much. One official in the back did not. The next morning the bard disappeared. Some say he was executed. Others claim he was promoted to a small post in a distant province, one with excellent soup and no audience. But there's a more delightful theory, that Wu's remaining supporters still quietly threaded through the bureaucracy, whisked him away, and installed him in a private court of laughter and wine, where he composed songs under a false name and insulted emperors in peace. Historians, as usual, are divided, but it speaks to something deeper. Even long after her death, Wu Zetian's name still had heat. You could get burned just by saying it too loudly or too fondly, and yet beneath the official hush, something else stirred. In the folklore of the countryside, Wu was being transformed, not into a villain, not even into a queen, but into a sort of folk goddess. In some stories, she became the protector of clever girls. In others, she visited scholars, in dreams correcting their grammar. One especially odd tale from Sichuan describes a young woman praying to Wu before taking the imperial exams. In disguise, she passed twice and eventually became the emperor's speechwriter. There is no record of her actual name, just a note in a surviving exam roster that reads, "Candidate 214 displayed alarming clarity, possibly divine intervention." Even in art, Wu returned not always named but unmistakable. In one Ming Dynasty scroll, painting a female figure sits atop a throne holding a scepter shaped like a lotus. Her face is impassive, her robe embroidered with owls. The artist called her the wise emptiness. No one was fooled. Modern scholars argue whether this was meant to flatter her memory or slyly undermine it. But let's be honest, you don't paint owls into a robe by accident. The point is she wouldn't stay buried. Some rulers are forgotten because they were small, others because they were merely efficient. But Wu Zetian was neither. She was enormous, disruptive, witty in a way that outlived the witless. She loomed, not like a mountain, but like a mirror held up polished and inconvenient. And perhaps that's why she endures. You see, most rulers shape policy. Wu shaped imagination. She forced people to reconsider what power looked like, what leadership sounded like. She bent history with hairpins and scrolls and long silences behind curtains that weren't quite as opaque as everyone liked to pretend. She forced the empire to ask, what if? And worse, what if she was right? Next, we draw closer to the hush before sleep, the winding down of our tale where ghosts soften and even the fiercest ruler begins to fade into candlelight and dew. By now, you've likely noticed something about Wu Zetian's story. It refuses to end. Even as centuries passed and new emperors declared new eras with new names and new hats, her shadow lingered in the corners of scrolls and songs, a shape too distinct to fully erase. Officially, she was gone, filed under necessary complications in the imperial archives. But unofficially, she was everywhere, in the way court ladies arched their brows, in the way ministers hesitated before interrupting, in the way young scholars practiced calligraphy with an extra flick at the end of each stroke, deliberate, elegant, and slightly subversive. Let's talk briefly about the mirror. One of Wu Zetian's lesser-known habits during her reign was her obsession with mirrors, not for vanity, though she certainly had the eyebrows to justify it, but for symbolism. She reportedly placed mirrors throughout the palace, in corridors, at court entrances, even in certain meditation halls, not to check appearances, but to reflect intention. A courtier once complained that even the floor watches you here. According to fringe accounts, one mirror survived her fall. It was said to be polished daily, even after her death, and displayed in a quiet corner of the palace near the inner archives. Legend claims that for years afterward, anyone who gazed into it too long would see not their own face, but a shadowed outline of a woman holding a scroll just behind their reflection. Make of that what you will. Her tomb, too, became part of the myth, not just for the wordless stele, though it remained the crown jewel of mysterious monumentry, but for what it might still contain. Archaeologists over the centuries attempted excavations, but each attempt ended in delay, debate, or mysteriously missing funding. One Ming official proposed opening the tomb fully, but his horse tripped 3 times on the way to court, and he took it as a divine veto. He submitted a request to be reassigned to melon inspection, and so the tomb remains sealed, unopened, undisturbed. Inside, they say, is not just her body, but shelves of records she preserved, her own edits of history, letters, poems, names, truths that never made it into the official scrolls. One story claims she left behind an unfinished play about a court filled with animals, where the wisest was a silent owl, and the goat from her early days finally received an honorary title. No proof of this, of course, but it's nice to think about. Back in the world of the living, Wu's descendants continued to serve in the government, some under assumed names, some bearing her family crest, discreetly stitched inside their robes. One bold scholar in the Qing dynasty publicly claimed to be her descendant. His lecture was interrupted by a sudden thunderstorm, which he took as approval. His students agreed and ran off to found a poetry club in her honor. It lasted 2 years and published exactly 1 collection titled Verses from Behind the Curtain. In modern times, Wu's image continued to evolve. A few decades ago, a university professor discovered a previously unstudied Tang-era scroll depicting a female figure presiding over a celestial tribunal. He named it Empress of the Stars. His colleagues scoffed. His students, however, embraced it. Within weeks, Wu Zetian fan art was circulating online. Some of it featured battle armor. Some of it featured cats. Most of it was surprisingly respectful. One such image, Wu standing on the edge of a mountaintop, one sleeve caught in the wind, a scroll unrolling endlessly behind her, became an unofficial symbol among young activists. They printed it on tote bags. You can still find them in certain bookstores. Look under Banned Yet Beautiful. So where are we now? We're in that strange realm where memory meets metaphor, where Wu Zetian has become more than the sum of her dates and deeds. She's a myth, a warning, an aspiration, a question mark, shaped like a crown. She's used to scare young men into humility and to inspire young women into boldness. She's praised by radicals, quoted by CEOs, and occasionally misattributed in inspirational posters involving cherry blossoms and suspiciously Western fonts. But no matter the form, historical villain, misunderstood, genius lipstick-wearing dragon, she remains the only woman in China's long imperial history to rule in her own name as emperor. Not empress consort, not regent, not mother, emperor. She did what no one else dared. She held the throne. She made it hers. And whether you love her, fear her, or don't quite know what to do with her, she left something behind that no dynasty could ever fully bury. Possibility. Next, we near the end, the final reflections, the still night wind, and the soft closing of a story that was never meant to be told quietly. The world kept spinning, as it always does, whether or not it remembers who once told it how. Long after Wu Zetian's body was sealed within the mountainside tomb of Qianling, the empire she had ruled moved on publicly, at least. New emperors were crowned. Old rituals were restored. The Tang dynasty returned to its ancestral rhythm, as if the reign of a woman had been no more than a brief summer thunderstorm, loud, electrifying, and quickly forgotten. But forgetting is never so simple. Her presence didn't vanish. It receded like ink in wet parchment, sinking deeper, harder to see, but impossible to remove. Her reforms, once so scandalous, remained in place. The examination system, the infrastructure networks, the merit appointments, they stayed. Emperors could change robes and names and ministers, but they found it hard to argue with policies that worked. Some did try. One official in the early Song dynasty reportedly proposed a return to pure lineage appointments. His own cousin had failed the civil exam 4 times. He argued that Wu's policies had disrupted the natural order. The room went very quiet. Then, without a word, the chief archivist pulled a dusty scroll from the imperial shelves, a tax record from Wu's reign, so precise it noted the exact number of grain sacks per household and who owed which mule. The official sat down. The matter was dropped. And that was how it went for generations. Wu Zetian's memory erased by decree, yet quietly re-verified by footnotes, ledgers, and common sense. Still, no one dared speak her name too often. She became known in euphemisms. The sovereign of the interruption. The empress who sat where none had sat. She of the mountain tomb. Courtiers referred to her policies without saying her. Poets wrote verses that mirrored her words but were signed with borrowed names. One scholar, unusually bold, published an essay titled The Efficient Tyrant. It circulated for 3 days before he disappeared to a very quiet teaching post in a village famous only for celery. But the people, as always, remembered differently. In rural provinces, women lit incense for her, not openly, not grandly, but with small private gestures. A plum blossom left at a local shrine. A candle lit near exam time beside a daughter's scrolls. Farmers, when asked who had first brought order to their canal systems, sometimes said, "The Empress who listened." She was becoming something more than historical. She was becoming myth. One tale passed between weavers in the south tells of a young woman who had a dream before taking her civil exam, in secret, dressed as a man. In the dream, she saw a woman seated at a loom made of stone, weaving silver threads that glowed like ink. The woman said nothing, just nodded once. The girl passed with the second highest score in her region. She never told anyone her real name. Another story, less elegant, involves a street performer in Luoyang who sang satirical songs about Wu, half praise, half insult. He was popular for a time. Then one day he stopped performing. When asked why, he only said, "She started appearing in the lyrics on her own. There's also the matter of the mirror. It's said that Wu once commissioned a bronze mirror so finely polished, so perfect in curvature, that it reflected not the face but the truth of the soul. She called it the silent judge. Where it ended up, no one knows. But some claim it still exists, hidden in a mountain monastery. The monks there do not deny it. They simply smile and say, "It's not the mirror that matters. It's what you do after looking." Meanwhile at court, her name continued to hover unspoken but heavy. A Tang-era general once refused a promotion, citing the cautionary example of unchecked female rule. His command collapsed 6 months later in a sandstorm, and a lesser-known officer promoted under a merit system Wu had championed restored order in 3 weeks. The record of that campaign was later revised to credit the general. But some scribes preserved the original scroll. One in the margins had written, "Still listening, aren't you?" And that's the thing. Wu never needed monuments. Not really. She left no official inscription. She didn't bother with an autobiography. She let the silence do the writing. And in that silence, every act of cautious reverence, every bitter critique, every secretly admired reform became part of her ongoing authorship. Her story had passed into its final phase interpretation. Was she cruel? Yes. Brilliant? Undoubtedly. Necessary? Possibly. Dangerous? Always. But more than anything, she was unforgettable. And in an empire that tried so often to rewrite her, it is telling that the only monument she truly left behind her stele says nothing at all. It doesn't need to. Everything else is still talking. Next we enter the penultimate watch of the night, where even legends dim and memory softens into something slower, sadder, and somehow more true. We've come a long way, you and I, through silken corridors and scroll-choked halls, past whispering monks and missing poets over censored stele and stormy footnotes. And now at the edge of it all, the story begins to lower its voice. Wu Zetian is long gone, her tomb sealed, her name for a time scrubbed. But the empire she once ruled still carried her breath like the scent of incense long after the coals have gone cold. Not in the palaces necessarily. Those had moved on, rebuilt, repainted, renamed, repopulated by men in taller hats who pretended not to remember who once wore the dragon robe with better posture. But if you looked in the right places, you'd still find her. In the civil exam offices where commoners still scribbled their future in borrowed ink. In the canal systems that traced her edicts like quiet rivers of legacy. In the storage chambers where scrolls dated to her reign were kept just a little too neatly. Her influence had become the kind that officials discussed only at night after tea. Of course, her methods were they'd begin and then trail off. No one wanted to be the one to admit how many of her systems still worked. Historians still argue whether this enduring influence was due to genius or just administrative brute force. But when the canal walls held and the census counts balanced, few dared complain aloud. A fringe account written by a Song Dynasty archivist with insomnia and a habit of eavesdropping claims that every 50 years a memo is quietly circulated among the imperial scribes, reminding them not to use her name in policy citations, even if the policies themselves remain useful. Attribute to Tang, it says, unless pressed. The archivist wrote this in a margin. The margin was erased, but someone copied it before the ink dried. There's also the matter of the whisper scrolls. In the back rooms of certain libraries, scholars tell of a few rare documents, unsigned, unbound, written in a hand too elegant to belong to any court scribe. They appear in sealed boxes, usually after someone dreams of plum blossoms or hears footsteps where there shouldn't be any. These scrolls contain policy suggestions, observations, sometimes poetry. They are always useful, and no one dares ask where they came from. Meanwhile, her image continued to shift. In plays, she returned as a queen, a ghost, a cunning judge in celestial court. In ballads, she was a woman born with ink on her fingers and fire in her hair. Some stories made her crueler, some kinder, but almost none made her forgettable. One popular folk tale, still told in some provinces today, describes a young scribe who mocked the Empress in a parody scroll. He dreamed that night of a banquet where everyone wore masks except one guest. The guest was silent, dressed in mourning white, and held a brush. When he awoke, the parody was gone, replaced with a flawlessly written poem titled Still Listening. He retired early. But even beyond these half-truths and lantern-lit stories, Wu's shadow lingered in language itself. Certain terms for leadership created during her reign stuck. Phrases like heaven's insight through mortal hands and the pen outweighs the blade-survived dynasties. So did the habit of double-checking every decree for balance, not between right and wrong, but between usefulness and ambition. And then, of course, there's the statue. We've spoken of the wordless stele before, but did you know that by the Yuan dynasty, some said it responded? Not aloud, of course, but by reflection. The myth goes that if you stood before the stone with a question in your heart about power, about justice, about how to forgive yourself for wanting more than you were told, you could have the stone would reveal a single word glowing faintly in your mind. No one ever saw the same word. Some saw wait, some saw remember. One saw rewrite and became a historian. One saw enough and left politics forever. It's probably just a story. But isn't it strange how often the most silent things are the ones that echo the loudest? In her lifetime, Wu Zetian built an empire and held it together with parchment patience and just enough ruthlessness to keep it all upright. She never apologized. She never flinched. And she never asked anyone to like her. What she did ask again and again was to be heard. And she was, even in silence, especially in silence. So now we near the end. Not of her, of course, she's far too entangled in everything that came after, but of our telling, which must eventually stop, if only to let the stillness speak. Next we descend fully into that stillness, into soft firelight and starlight, and the gentle place where stories finally become dreams. So we arrive at the end, not the end of Wu Zetian's life or even her legacy, but the end of this long walk through her shadow. It is quiet here, not empty, just still. The dynasties have passed. The court has changed hands more times than anyone bothers to count. The roads she paved have been repaved, renamed, sometimes lost to time. But beneath the surface, her signature still clings to the grain of the empire like a watermark, subtle, buried, unmistakable. And her story somehow has refused to settle. You see, most rulers eventually melt into the historical furniture. Their names become trivia. Their decrees become footnotes. Their portraits hang in museums beside velvet ropes and dusty commentary, but not Wu. Every few decades, someone reopens her case. A scholar, a writer, a dramatist, a young student with a frown on her face and a pen in her hand, and every time they think they've found something new, something definitive, something to finally classify her, they haven't, they won't. Because Wu Zetian was never just an emperor. She was a contradiction made flesh, a disruption wearing perfume, a ruler who knew that silence was louder than speech and presence, stronger than approval. She never fit the story, so she rewrote it. In one later scroll, anonymous, as they so often are, there's a line scratched faintly in the margin. She did not demand loyalty. She created systems that made loyalty practical. Another, written by a court librarian 2 dynasties removed, simply reads, "Her name was not spoken, but her methods were still followed." That is power. Real rooted power, not the kind that rides in on horses or ends in fireworks, but the kind that sits quietly in a room long after everyone has left, still affecting the way the chairs are arranged. And what do we do with someone like that? History doesn't know. It stammers. It wavers. It tries to contain her in metaphors. Dragon, phoenix, serpent, mirror. But metaphors don't govern empires, people do. And Wu Zetian did. She governed with intelligence sharper than most men's swords, with patience honed in exile, with memory like a ledger, and instinct like a strategist. She ruled. Without apology, without precedent, without permission. And the price? It was steep. Her rule was not gentle. Many were punished. Many silenced. But those who condemn her too quickly forget that every emperor ruled with the same fist, only without the audacity of wearing earrings. She didn't invent cruelty. She inherited it. She refined it. And she wrapped it in red silk and made it answer to her. But she also made space. She opened doors no one even knew were locked. She built pathways into power for people whose names had never been spoken in throne rooms before. And she did it all while being watched, doubted, whispered about, and perhaps most intolerably explained. But not anymore. Now the scrolls fall shut, the whispers fade, the explanations tire themselves out, and we are left with the most powerful image of all, a woman seated on a throne once forbidden to her, calm, still, listening, not begging to be loved, not demanding to be feared, simply there, as unmovable and as undeniable as the stele she left behind. They say history is written by the victors, but Wu Zetian never waited to be crowned before she picked up the pen. She was not waiting to be remembered. She was making herself impossible to forget. And now, after all this time, after all the scrolls and candles and contradictions, we do not close her story. We place it gently like a rare document back into the vault of the mind. Somewhere it will stay, not lost, not dismissed, just quiet and waiting. The candles have burned low. The air is soft now, thick with the weight of stories told slowly, carefully, like incense curling around the rafters of memory. You don't have to think anymore. The scrolls are stacked neatly. The throne room is empty. Outside the night deepens into velvet, and even the stars seem to hold their breath. Perhaps you're lying there now, eyes closed, hands still. Perhaps the room is quiet. Perhaps only the hum of a fan, the rhythm of your breath, the smallest reminder that the world is allowed at last to rest. There's no more to uncover tonight. No more politics, no verdicts, no rulers left to impress or overthrow. The footsteps of power have long since faded into the dust, and even the names feel softer now, rounded by time and forgetting. That's all right. Let your body sink. Let your thoughts drift. Let the tale of Wu Zetian slip gently into the same place where old dreams go when you no longer need them to stay awake. You've walked far tonight through dynasty and silence, through gardens and judgment, through the long corridors of ambition and consequence. Now you've arrived somewhere warm, somewhere dim, somewhere safe. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let the air cool around your shoulders. Let the world at last fall away. There's nothing left to do now. You don't have to be brilliant or strategic or strong. You just have to sleep. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.